Imagine a world where the most famous fedora in film wasn't worn by the man you picture right now. What if one scheduling decision, one studio call, had swapped out the face of a legend entirely? The Indiana Jones you know exists only because of razor-thin choices. Random illnesses hit the crew. Casting swaps happened at the very last minute, and wild improvisations carried scenes that could have sunk the film. Here's the twist. The version of Indy you love today was almost to someone else. Hit subscribe, and let's dive straight in, starting with a chase that was anything but safe. Picture this, a tunnel carved from stone, dim light flickering, and a massive sphere hurtling toward you with crushing force. That wasn't a flashy digital effect. It was the real opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark, filmed with a physical prop and a very real sense of danger. The boulder looked ancient, but it was actually a fiberglass construction built large enough to tower over Harrison Ford. Even then, its size meant it still weighed several hundred pounds. Spielberg insisted on using the practical prop because only a tangible object could sell the weight and panic on screen. To capture the chase properly, the crew set up cameras from multiple angles, which meant Ford had to run the same stretch over and over, multiple takes in a slick, narrow passage with the prop gaining speed behind him. Think of it less like a movie stunt, more like an insane obstacle course, steep ramp, narrow floor, massive prop right on your heels. It wasn't just about getting through once, it was about repeating the sprint until every shot matched perfectly. The exertion showed in his face and movements, which gave the final cut that lived in exhaustion we now take as part of the character. When the edit stitched those runs together, the result was seamless terror. One breathtaking escape defined Indiana Jones before he even spoke, and it set the stage for another razor-thin choice that nearly changed who wore the fedora at all. What if I told you the man most associated with adventure wasn't even locked in until the clock was already ticking? That's how uncertain Indiana Jones' casting really was. Harrison Ford was never the early favorite. George Lucas actually resisted the idea, worried that working with Ford yet again, after American Graffiti and Star Wars, would make him look like a director who couldn't move past one actor. So for months, the search stretched on. Big names circled the role. Tom Selleck impressed producers. Dramatic choices like Nick Nolte were weighed. Even comic actors like Bill Murray and Steve Martin were discussed. Each possibility pulled the character in a different direction, rugged, serious, or tongue-in-cheek. Meanwhile, the production schedule loomed larger every day, and the one part that mattered most was still empty. Finally, with sets built and cameras ready, the choice had to be made. Ford was brought in only weeks before shooting began. That left almost no time for rehearsal, no window for rewrites, just a mad scramble to put him in the hat and hope the performance worked. Spielberg had pushed for Ford all along, convinced he could shape the right mix of charm and grit. Once the cameras rolled, it was clear that conviction paid off. But that narrow decision didn't come without consequence. In fact, a single contract clause had already tilted fate in another direction, and that twist changed Hollywood history. Now picture this, Tom Selleck, mustache and all, stepping into a shadowy temple with whip in hand. For a short but serious moment, that wasn't just an idea. Selleck had screen tested, won over Spielberg and Lucas, and was officially given the role of Indiana Jones. His mix of rugged looks and easy charm made him their favorite candidate to carry the balance of professor and adventurer, but CBS had other plans. Selleck was locked into a contract for Magnum, PI, and when the show was greenlit, the network refused to release him. That clash shut the door on his chance, even though he'd already secured the part. Selleck himself later admitted how close it came, but contracts in Hollywood can be as immovable as stone. The fallout was immediate. With production days away, producers had to scramble. Selleck's binding TV schedule forced them to find a replacement, an emergency recast that pushed Harrison Ford into the spotlight. Ford wasn't a backup in the creative sense, but he was a late addition, called in because no other path remained open. It's one of those moments where a single clause reshaped movie history. Had CBS relented, Selleck's performance might have defined the role, and Ford's career could have unfolded very differently. Imagine the franchise with Magnum's cadence. Would it have carried the same weight? And as it turns out, the story of Indy's identity doesn't stop with casting. Even his very name had an origin stranger than anyone expected. Here's the twist. The swashbuckling archaeologist with a fedora and whip was named after a dog. Not a lost explorer or a mythical hero. George Lucas's Alaskan Malamute, who sat by him as he worked. Lucas wanted something bold, something that felt ripped straight from the cover of a dime store pulp magazine, and Indiana had the punch he needed. That same dog shaped more than one world, riding shotgun in Lucas's car. The Malamute's loyal presence directly inspired Chewbacca in Star Wars. So the very pet dozing in Lucas's home ended up fueling two of the most enduring figures in modern cinema, a daring archaeologist and a towering Wookiee. What makes the story stand out is the casualness of it. Lucas often built larger-than-life myths from small details in his own life. The dog's name wasn't the result of a focus group or long debates. It was instinct, a private joke turned global shorthand for adventure. And that instinct paid off. With just one choice, Lucas gave the character a human touch years before Harrison Ford, the first cracked the whip on screen. Think about that for a moment. The groundwork for one of cinema's most durable heroes came not from market research, but from a bond with a four-legged companion. It shows how thin the line can be between the ordinary and the legendary. And soon, that line was tested again, this time not in naming the hero, but in deciding the very tone of his greatest adventure. Now imagine if Indiana Jones's first outing hadn't been a pulse-pounding adventure at all, but something far darker. Early drafts of Raiders of the Lost Ark leaned hard into horror, sketching out occult forces and grotesque imagery that would have shifted the story into nightmare territory rather than swashbuckling adventure. Instead of clever escapes and action set pieces, those early pages played with temples haunted by the supernatural. You catch glimpses of that vision in the finished film, most famously in the face melting climax. That grotesque moment is horror through and through, so intense that the filmmakers had to add a sheet of fire over the shot to even secure a broad release. It stands as a leftover fragment of what Raiders of the Lost Ark might have been if the team had leaned fully into the darker draft. The risk was obvious. If Indy spent his story reacting to occult terrors, he'd shift from decisive adventurer to reluctant survivor. The film would have lost the pulpy momentum that made it so distinct. Spielberg recognized this and steered the project back toward quick pacing, myth-tinged spectacle, and the lighter tone that allowed the character to thrive beyond a single experiment. That choice didn't erase the horror completely, it blended it. The Ark's Wrath still delivers real terror, but within a framework that families could enjoy and critics could celebrate. It was a balance that set the franchise's DNA and elevated Indy from cult figure to global hero. Of course, uncertain drafts didn't stop there. Even later chapters of the series started in stranger directions before finding the version you know today. Imagine gearing up for The Last Crusade, and instead of witty banter between father and son, you're watching Indy explore a haunted castle crawling with spirits. That was George Lucas's original pitch for the third film. Early outlines leaned into gothic horror, with eerie settings and supernatural threats that would have pushed the series closer to a ghost story than the globe-trotting adventures audiences expected. The gamble was big, but Spielberg wasn't convinced. Having already explored haunted house imagery in Poltergeist, he pushed back against making a horror-styled indie movie. What those drafts lacked was an emotional center. They risked stripping away the humor and warmth that balanced the danger. The turning point came when the story shifted toward Indiana Jones's relationship with his father. By making that dynamic the heart of the film, the whole project found a new rhythm. Family tension replaced gothic chills. Wit and warmth balanced the mythic stakes. In just one pivot, the tone moved from haunted spectacle to heartfelt adventure. Two outside forces helped seal that tone. Playwright Tom Stoppard quietly refined the script, sharpening dialogue without official credit. And once Sean Connery stepped in as Indy's father, he reshaped the role, playing it with charm and authority while adding humor that softened the edges. The result was a film that resonated far beyond its stunts. And just as the shape of The Last Crusade hinged on unusual choices, some of the creatures and horrors in the series came from equally unexpected sources. Imagine hearing a snake hiss in total darkness and realizing the sound didn't come from an actual reptile at all. One of the best-kept secrets of Raiders of the Lost Ark is that its creepiest moments weren't built with exotic animals or expensive rigs, but with sound tricks cooked up at Lucasfilm. Ben Burtt, the sound designer, famously dragged his fingers through a cheese casserole to mimic the slithering noise of thousands of snakes. The thunderous rumble of the boulder was actually a car rolling on gravel. And the heavy creak of the Ark's lid? That came straight from a common toilet lid. In other words, everyday items turned into terrifying soundscapes. The team leaned on this resourceful approach throughout the film's production. They used household objects, kitchen pans, and even theme park recordings to craft audio that felt ancient and dangerous. What makes it fascinating is how simple tools created an illusion that still holds up on modern sound systems. By keeping things low budget but wildly inventive, the production made terror out of the ordinary and so danger you could almost feel through the speakers. When you watch Indy surrounded by hissing snakes, or hear the ox groan before unleashing its fury. You're not just witnessing spectacle, you're hearing the creativity of a crew solving problems with imagination instead of money. It shows how much of the legend came from choices behind the camera. And while those sounds shaped the dread of Raiders, one of Indy's key companions almost carried a very different story. Think about Marion Ravenwood not just as Indy's fiery foil, but as a character who almost carried more weight in the story than we ever saw. Early drafts and casting conversations pictured her in very different ways, and at one point, she was positioned to be more involved than the final version allowed. What ended up on screen was a streamlined character, but the road there shows how uncertain her place in Raiders really was. As the script went through revisions, Marion's role shifted. Instead of being written as a co-lead, her function narrowed into sparring partner, rival, and reluctant love interest. This change shaped how her chemistry with Ford came across. Sharp, funny, and memorable, but also meant a whole layer of depth was left unrealized, and audiences got the energy of a fight and flirt dynamic, but the earlier ambition of a richer arc was trimmed down before filming. Casting made that uncertainty even sharper. Amy Irving and Deborah Winger both circled the role, and each would have given Marion a very different edge. Ultimately, Karen Allen won the part, but she didn't just inherit what was on the page. She pushed against the risk of Marion being reduced to a damsel, fighting to preserve toughness, humor, and agency. That choice is part of why her performance still feels fresh decades later. The Marion we know is iconic, but the drafts remind us she might have looked very different. And speaking of changes behind the scenes, what happened on location soon after pushed the cast and crew to their very limit. Shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark in Tunisia quickly turned from filmmaking into survival. The desert heat was brutal, water was scarce, and worse, a wave of dysentery ripped through the cast and crew. Almost everyone fell sick at some point, including John Rhys Davies, who was hit especially hard. The set became less about cinema and more about endurance. There was, however, one exception. Steven Spielberg avoided the illness entirely. Why? He had packed a private stash of canned food from England. SpaghettiOs, beans, anything off the grocery shelf. While most of the crew was sidelined, Spielberg kept going, powered by tins shipped from home. The illness shaped Raiders in ways nobody planned. Harrison Ford was battling it himself and could barely stay out of his trailer for long. During the Cairo sequence, he faced a carefully staged whip versus sword duel with a stuntman. But Ford, drained and unable to perform the acrobatics, suggested a quicker fix. Indy draws his gun and fires. Spielberg agreed. That small change saved Ford's strength, kept the shooting schedule intact, and created one of the most iconic, defining moments in the entire series. Even away from the illness, the crew fought through accidents and exhaustion. Stunts had to be tweaked or re-choreographed when performers went down hurt. Yet out of those rough conditions came raw, unpolished energy that helped make the film feel so immediate. The chaos of Tunisia proved how fragile the production could be, but also how the right actor could steady a story. And that balance became even clearer when it came to choosing Indy's closest ally. Think about Saleh for a second, that booming laugh, the strength in his words, and his loyalty that anchored Indy in tough moments. Now flip that image to Danny DeVito. It might seem hard to picture, but producers originally wanted him for the role. His sharp wit and fast delivery made sense on paper, a comic contrast to Ford's straight-faced adventurer. The problem was timing. DeVito was locked into his schedule, filming Taxi, and the commitment left no room for desert expeditions. In Hollywood, scheduling conflicts decide careers as much as auditions do, and here it ended his chance before shooting began. That's when John Rhys Davies stepped in. What he brought wasn't slapstick or fast-talking humor, but a deeper weight. His voice carried authority. His presence filled the frame. Instead of outrageous comedy, Saleh emerged as a warm, loyal equal to Indy. The character became less about punchlines and more about heart, which gave the film a grounded balance between spectacle and trust. DeVito, for his part, later found a nearly parallel niche in Romancing the Stone, playing a comic foil in another adventure film. Watching that performance shows why producers saw him as fit for Saleh. It worked, just in a different story. Casting choices like this prove how fragile tone can be. One actor changes not only a role, but the entire mood of a film. Which Saleh would you rather have seen, the quick-witted trickster or the steadfast ally? And when you add up all those near misses, you realize Indy, as we know him, was never guaranteed. Indy's legacy isn't just about daring escapes and lost treasures. It's about the chaos behind the camera that made those moments possible. Casting scrambles, illnesses on set, and split-second improvisations weren't setbacks. They were the raw pieces that shaped the hero we came to know. Think of it like piecing together a mosaic. On their own, each fragment, whether a broken contract, a changed stunt, or a rough shoot, seems awkward. But set side by side, they reveal the outline of a legend. That handful of choices turned chance into cinema history. Hit subscribe and let's dive straight in and keep exploring and stay curious.